Welcome to the 9th session of the series South Asian Englishes Current Research Directions. This session deals with the research avenues in the intercultural pragmatics of South Asian Englishes with the help of the elicitation tools such as discourse completion task and discourse production task.
Thank you. So those of you who have read the article by Kashyap this morning on the state of the art, you will remember that he says, well, there is not enough work being done on pragmatics of South Asian languages. And this is something you can, if you absolutely want to investigate with the corpus, but it's much easier and also more interesting and more accessible if you use methods, for example, elicitation tools, and our handout is one example of that. I'm not quite sure how many of you are familiar with the concepts of politeness in language. I think most of you would be like positive and negative politeness. Are these familiar terms?
Yeah, Brown and Levinson.
Brown and Levinson. So if not, I don't mind repeating that. I shall? Yeah. So the most influential concept of politeness in language comes, as you say, from Brown and Levinson. There's been another one by Jeffrey Leach, but it's not nearly as influential. And the idea is, or the concept of politeness is built on the concept of face, which in its turn is a notion taken from Erving Goffman. And he says every person has a face, the public image he or she wants to project of himself or herself. And so that will be, when you use politeness, politeness is a face-saving strategy. And the important points are the two concepts of positive and negative politeness. Negative politeness doesn't mean impoliteness, you know that, but just for repetition. Positive politeness are those politeness devices in language which stress the fact that you are a member of a group. You could say positive politeness is about showing solidarity. Negative politeness are those politeness methods which regard or take care of your negative face, and your negative face is your desire to be autonomous and free from imposition. And you tailor, or you can classify politeness strategies accordingly. For example, if I want you to do something and I use a positive politeness device, I stress that we are all together, members of groups, and I would say, oh, let's do that. That means I'm talking to all of us, me included. If I use a negative politeness strategy, when I want to make sure I don't threaten your negative face, your desire to be an autonomous person, then I would use an indirect way of stating what I want you to do. I would say, for example, would you mind doing that? If I use a speech act like do it, in the imperative, the direct speech act in the imperative, then I would maximally threaten your face because you don't really have an option not to do it. But if I rephrase what I want you to do with a question, then I would, perhaps only in principle, but still I would give you the option of saying no. In that sense, the threat to your negative face is minimized. And what we have heard or found, can you pass? No, okay. And this, I think I need one to look at as well. Not quite sure whether the ones behind you had it. Yeah. And this concept of positive and negative phase has been criticized because Brown and Levinson say the concept of politeness in language is first of all universal. So all human societies will express politeness in their language in one way or the other. And I think that's quite right. I mean, I would assume this is correct because we're all social beings. We have to interact with each other, and politeness plays a role in that. But the concept of positive and negative politeness has been criticized in the sense, or it has been pointed out that this may be imbalanced between Eastern and Western cultures. So in a very general level, it has been said the concept of negative politeness, your desire for freedom, for autonomy, is perhaps more pronounced in Western societies, which are more individualized. And the concept of positive politeness, where you are part of a group, where you think of yourself as part of a larger entity, the family, for example, that this would be more typical or more pronounced in Eastern, for example, many Asian societies. So this would be basic notion of politeness and also the first indication of intercultural pragmatics. So there may be politeness norms which differ, or the emphasis on politeness norms between positive and negative politeness may differ from culture to culture. And quite a lot of research has been done in that respect. And some research that has been specifically done on Indian English in terms of intercultural pragmatics has, for example, stressed that some of these linguistic devices which we use to express politeness are already implemented in the Indian languages. For example, Indian languages are known to have very extensive kinship terms. That you have different words for maternal uncle, paternal uncle, cousin brother, and so on and so on. So it's not the case that you can't express that in a language like English, but then you have to say cousin brother. You don't have just one word which states that. And so these very extensive kinship terms have been taken to be an indicator that many Asian societies, in this case Indian society, stresses positive politeness more, belonging. Then it has, for example, been said that directness and indirectness, when we perform a speech act, we can do it directly when the grammatical form matches the function. For example, I want to give you a command, that would be the function, and the grammatical form would be the imperative. That is a direct speech act. There's different classes of direct speech acts. Some of you may be aware of that. But if I, for example, want to give you a command and ask you, would you mind doing this? Then the grammatical form is an interrogative, so the form does not match the function and it makes it an indirect speech act. And it has been said that many cultures prefer indirect speech acts rather than direct speech acts. And sometimes these very specific cultural preferences is something we only notice when we come to a foreign country. Or we have to actually learn that if you come into contact with a different culture. For example, in American English, when your teacher wants to criticize you, he or she might say, you might want to reconsider that. Which actually means what you've written is crap. So it's a very, very polite way of criticizing. Politeness and pragmatics is also something which comes slightly later in the acquisition of language than grammatical structure. For example, if you ask a kid, do you have to be that noisy? Which is a rhetorical question, they will probably say yes. Or do you like living in that mess? I don't mind. So these would be examples that pragmatics comes slightly later than language acquisition in life, and for us as learners of another language, we probably find it more difficult to learn pragmatic competence because this is not something you can easily get out of a book. I remember from my own experience of coming to India, when you're invited for dinner, and in a European context, if somebody is putting food on your table, and then you say, thank you, which means stop. Thank you. And then I learned that you have to say bus. That worked. So this is how I learned it. And so one way of investigating intercultural pragmatic competence or intercultural pragmatic differences is an example of this is technology which is called discourse completion task. So this has been used for more than 30 years successfully in intercultural pragmatics. They come in two different forms. First of all, the discourse completion task, where you give the speaker or the reader or someone participate, to give them a cue. Or the discourse production task, that would be number 4, where you just give a general outline and give people freedom to elaborate on it themselves. So the point is to find out, for example, how do you make a request in different cultures? What kind of strategies do you have? How do you pay a compliment in different cultures? How do you approach a stranger in different cultures? These are all interactional activities, and one way of getting at them is with a questionnaire. And so I thought, so the technique is well known. Of course, it has its drawbacks in the sense it's not naturally occurring speech, but it's elicited. So that's one drawback, but the method has been found to be quite reliable. Depends on how many people you involve. You might also find differences. You have to involve quite a lot of people because you might find difference from person to person. So one person might be a shy person, the other might be a very outgoing person. But what I wanted to give you is just an idea of how such a questionnaire can look like. And what I would like you to do is actually get your neighbor and look at this. What would be your response if you were asked to fill in number 1, 2, 3, 4? How would you go about it? And then we can perhaps we take 15 minutes on that and perhaps collect your responses and see perhaps already within this group we may find probably then individual differences. We're not that many different cultures being represented here, but this is something you could do on a larger scale. But it's not that much work collecting these responses and then analyzing them yourself and making a contribution to intercultural pragmatics. So what I would first like you to do, the first 3 are about making requests. How do you do that? What kind of strategy would you prefer? Would you rather stress positive politeness devices? Would you rather stress negative politeness devices? How would you go about this? So have a look at these situations that are recorded here and how would you do that? The 4th is much more open. This is about small talk. How do you engage in small talk? What are safe topics to talk about? This may change from culture to culture.
Like
Weather.
Sports, etc.
I think weather might work universally around the globe. For example, there are interesting studies by Juliane Haus, a German linguist, and she says from what she studied within a European country is that Germans are much more direct. So she found that Germans may start a conversation and talk about politics and other, so how do you like, what do you think of the latest election, and don't you hate our prime minister or something like that. She says this is more or less usual in other cultures. So it's not saying that all Germans are direct, but there is a tendency to be more direct than other cultures. And cultures, East Asian cultures are supposed to be very, very polite and indirect. There's also what you can investigate, a difference in complimenting behavior. A typical response, if you compliment a Japanese person, let's say a Japanese woman says, "Oh, I like your dress," and then the typical response would be, "Oh, it's nothing, it was very cheap," or something like that. That's in a way that you do not say, "Oh, thank you very much," but you put yourself down. Or if you're given a gift in Japan and you say, "Oh, what a wonderful gift," and they say, "Oh, it's nothing, I got it very cheaply," something like that. So what I would like you to do is look at this. What would be your responses? So this is about requests and small talk. You could also investigate complimenting behavior. You can also investigate, that's an interesting point, how do you close a conversation when you are on the phone? How do you, it's like discourse analysis, you have this that you don't say bye and put down the receiver. Sorry, this was very old-fashioned, this was very 20th century. So you don't say bye and put down the receiver. But it typically takes some while. Yeah, bye. So it's not like an immediate stop of the conversation. So how do you, in a way, start the end of the conversation? Because if you just say bye and then stop the conversation that might be unusual. So think about, first of all, I would like you to look at this questionnaire, perhaps go together with your next neighbor and see how would you go about this, what would be your response. And then we will compare, what have we found, what are the dominant patterns in this room. And then please also, and that would then be the next step, what else? How would you draw up your own questionnaire if you wanted to investigate a specific kind of pragmatic behavior?